let's start. First of all, we are very happy to interview you on the behalf of 何だっけ oral history of Tibetan studies. And the first question is from your background, how was your childhood days and how was your family?
Okay, I'll talk about the childhood and my family. I was born near Kumagaya City, Saitama Prefecture, the suburbs of Greater Tokyo, which was a place of refuge from the World War II. My father was a medical doctor and a researcher of rabies at the University of Tokyo, who later discovered interferon. Throughout the primary and the secondary schools, I had no interest in any academic target. My interest went exclusively to long-distance learning.
And you went to high school?
Okay, yeah, I went to the high school. My fascination towards running continued until I was 18 years old. But just before the Tokyo Olympics Games in 1964, I saw TV programs which reported the research results of University of Tokyo expedition to the Andes civilization and the University of Kyoto expedition to the Middle East. The former introduced the rise and fall of civilization, while the latter, the original species of wheat and origin of agriculture. Then my interest drastically turned to cultural anthropology, especially religion.
And you try to go to the university?
Yes. So in order to study the anthropology, I tried to enter the University of Tokyo, but I failed. And I entered the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, where my major was French. This university was intended to be a kind of liberal arts college, and it has a vast range of splendid professors in the field of humanities. While I was obtaining the practical knowledge of French and the reading capability of ancient French, I was charmed by Professor Tokunaga Yasumoto's lectures on linguistics. His specialty was oral linguistics, especially Hungarian. And his way of guidance and supervision was quite unique. His advice was, number one, never fix the language of your specialty until you are 30 years old. Number two, have 2 or 3 bosses. He didn't encourage us to write a graduation thesis. Instead, he gave a few reading assignments. The articles he specified were Emil Bambnist's historical approach to the Indo-European languages, Edward Sapir's typology, and Nikolai Trubetskoy's phonology. I believe that this reading assignment gave me a wide perspective to languages. I consulted him my future stage of learning, asking if I had better go to the University of Tokyo Graduate School. He instantly said no, since at that time Professor Hattori of Department of Linguistics there was mad after Chomsky's generative grammar. Then my eyes went to Kyoto University, but its campus was shut down because of our series of student revolt. Professor Tokunaga recommended to see Professor Hori Ichiro, a specialist of Japanese folklore and shamanism, who just moved from Tohoku University to Tokyo University. probably because Tokunaga knew that I was also interested in religion.
Then you went to Tokyo University.
Yeah, so then Professor Hori accepted me to the graduate school and advised me to study Tibetan religion, Bon, however. While I collaborated with Professor Hori in his translation of Mircea Eliade's Shamanism in French into Japanese, I started to study Tibetan religion and the language itself. It was timely that Professor Yamaguchi Zuiho had joined Tokyo University teaching Tibetan. Professor Yamaguchi spent 8 years in Paris studying under Professor Rolf Alfred Stan. He compiled the textbook himself by hand, and his explanation and interpretation of Tibetan grammar was quite persuasive. However, I realized later that almost all the examples were from Bunko's morphological index. They were not Buddhist texts, but really a natural one. After the primary Tibetan class, he read the fifth Dalai Lama's Namtar, which continued for 5 years. Professor Tokunaga also recommended to see Professor Kitamura Hajime, who used to be the only Japanese specialist of modern Tibetan. He had been one of the central promoters of Tibetan studies in this country. In 1961, he attended the international gathering held in Rome, where Tibetologists worldwide met to discuss how to carry out joint research project with Tibetan refugees who fled to India and Nepal in 1959. According to the agreements at that meeting, the Tōyō Bunko, which is translated as Oriental Library, started its project concerning Tibetan culture under the sponsorship of Rockefeller Foundation and the Ministry of Education of Japan. The library invited 3 Tibetans, Reverend Sonam Gyatso, a Sakyapa incarnated Lama from Ngor Monastery, Reverend Ketsun Sampo, a Nimapa scholar monk, and Mrs. Tserindroma, a laywoman from Charon family. Professor Kitamura urged me into coming to the library to hear how the actual Tibetan sounds like. Then I went there and stayed for an hour, hearing the native speakers talk. I could catch a very limited number of words they spoke, and I did not understand what they were talking about. But I was literally stunned by their beautiful Rasa sound. The Tōyō Bunko is a library cum institute specialized to Oriental cultures and history, having constantly been a unique place. It was established in 1924 by Mr. Iwasaki Hisaya, the third CEO of the Mitsubishi Syndicate. Having the George Ernest Morrison's collection of books and documents concerning Chinese contemporary history as its nucleus, Iwasaki expanded the range of collection to Tibet, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia. Mr. Morrison was an Australian journalist who stayed in Beijing during China's age of convergence and served the Republic of China government as an advisor. He collected not only books and papers, but also political propaganda bills distributed in town. These views may seem quite local and trivial, but they are the testimony of a real history. I must add that he was a splendid collector and a perfect librarian at the same time. He sold off his collection in 1917. Fortunately, I could learn the colloquial Tibetan at the Tōyō Bunko, as well as the classical Tibetan under Professor Yamaguchi at the Tokyo University.
You learned the colloquial Tibetan, and probably you went to the fieldwork this time?
Yes, so 1 year later, I jumped in Tibetan refugee settlement in India to brush up my practicability of spoken Tibetan and to collect basic words of various dialects. I spent 3 months in Dharamsala and 6 months in Bairakupe, Mysore. I could almost attain the expected results from this field trip, but I didn't recognize the importance of Gyalrong at the time.
Why did Professor Hori recommended you to study Tibetan religion? Because he was a Japanese specialist of Japanese religion.
Yes, but at the same time, he was a specialist of shamanism.
Okay.
And so from the very broad perspective of shamanism, Tibet's shamanism is quite characteristic, I guess. So I don't think he had enough knowledge of Tibetan or Bon religion, but he knew the name because he spent several months in Chicago with Major Eliad, and Eliad was a kind of fan of Ralph Alfred Stan.
Oh.
They belong to the same generation. They know each other. Maybe that's the reason why Hori recommended both.
So you joined the Tōyō Bunko.
Yes, back from India in 1974, I joined the research department of the library, Tōyō Bunko, as a junior fellow. The national project of Tibetan Studies that started in 1963 was still going on, even after the 3 native scholars left the library. My work was to manage the money matters of the project and to take care of daily life of Tibetan collaborators whom the library invited every year. Among these tasks, the most significant encounter was that with Dr. Samten Karmay. The Tōyō Bunko invited him twice, and his knowledge and sharp analysis of Bon religion impressed many Japanese scholars. My interest towards Bon was implanted by him. This library was also an ideal place for Tibetan linguistics. First of all, it has a complete set of references. Secondly, I had a few informants of Tibetan available anytime. Thirdly, Professor Kitamura, the head of the Tibet seminar, assigned me a compilation of textbooks of colloquial Tibetan for beginners. He needed it for the summer intensive course at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, which was his new tenure place. This task was extremely meaningful for me in that I had ample time and chance to digest what Professor Kitamura and others accumulated. In 1976, the late Professor Hashimoto Mantaro organized a US-Japan workshop on Sino-Tibetan linguistics at the foot of Mount Fuji, where many famous researchers in the US and Japan gathered to discuss whole day. and I was allowed to attend the meeting as an assistant. Among these scholars, I was impressed by Mr. Paul Benedict and Professor James Matisoff. Their whole wide perspective towards the Sino-Tibetan and Tibeto-Burman frameworks opened my eyes. I felt that I was gradually grasping the real and appropriate position of Tibetan and Gyalrong in those contexts. After the workshop, Professor Matisoff encouraged me to join the UC Berkeley's graduate program. Professor Kitamura also consented.
So you decided to go UC Berkeley.
Yes. The courseworks at the UC Berkeley were quite tough. The evaluation system by GPA was so rigid that 1/3 of newcomers were kicked out of the PhD programs of any UC campus with a terminal MA by the end of the fourth quarter. Then we were supposed to write 3 qualifying papers in which 3 different languages and 3 different methods should be combined. I chose the morphosyntax of Gyalrong, verb phrase, the historical study of Tibetan prefixes, and acoustic phonetics of Japanese pitch accents. This was a good experience which gave me some hints as an all-round field worker. The most important harvest from UC's education was that I could realize the meaning of Gyalrong research and its historical position in the broad Sino-Tibetan context. It was also fortunately for me that Professor Chan Kun, who had conducted an on-site survey in the Gyalrong-speaking area during the 1940s, was teaching in another department on the same campus, although his research interest was somewhat different from mine. It was lucky for me that I was given a chance to teach Tibetan for 3 quarters at the Oriental Languages Department as an acting instructor for Professor Lancaster, who serves the department as the chairman. It also was a surprising reunion with Reverend Sonam Gyatso there. After he quitted the Tōyō Bunko, he visited California to join his younger brother's monastery. Because of some problem within the monastery, he moved alone to Oakland, the neighboring city to Berkeley. He helped me again in my research on the Tibetan color terminology. Another exciting encounter was with Professor Snellgrove, whom the Graduate Theological Union, an auxiliary organ to UC Berkeley, invited for intensive course Tibetan religion. He always traveled on Concorde, a supersonic jet liner.
So you met Sonam Gyatso again in UC Berkeley.
Yes.
So if you have any impression on the Sonam Gyatso, you have any impression?
Any impression?
Yes.
Well, at that time, he was quite eager to republish his mandala, a set of mandala, which was reprinted from Kodansha later. But he was quite busy about that. So at that time, maybe Mr. Tachikawa had a very good contact with him. I have no idea about the mandala.
When and where did you meet the Gyalrong language? At the conference at Hashimoto Moto?
Gyalrong language?
Yeah.
Well, first encounter was 1972 when I went to India.
Oh.
Oh. Yeah. During my stay in Bairakupe's settlement, I conducted some dialect survey. At that time, one monk introduced that language as a very strange Tibetan dialect. So that's my concept to Gyalrong, but it was not the case. Gyalrong is not a Tibetan or Tibet Bodic. It is rather Chiangic. But at the time, I didn't realize what it is.
So you finished the PhD in US Berkeley, and then you came back to Japan.
Yes. After having finished all the requirements at Berkeley, except for the dissertation, I returned to Japan in the spring of 1980 to join the National Museum of Ethnology, which needed a specialist of Tibetan studies. This institution was established in 1977 as an inter-university research institute, where professors are requested to collect related anthropological materials from their field of specialty to describe and display them to the general public and to organize joint research projects according to their intellectual interest. The first task assigned was the description of the Aoki Bunkyo's collection of Tibetan objects. This monk entered Tibet early 20th century, staying for 3 years in central Lhasa, and brought many daily life objects and some Buddhist texts. Contrary to the Tada Tokan, who brought huge Tibetan Buddhist texts, Aoki collection reflects the living and vivid life of ordinary people of Lhasa. In the fall of 1980, I was given an opportunity to participate in a field research project conducted with the grant in aid for scientific research of the then Ministry of Education, Science and Culture. The project leader was the late Professor Kitamura Hajime, who was the Director General at the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia and Africa, Tōyō University of Foreign Studies. In this project, I engaged in describing Tibetan dialects spoken in the upper Gandaki Valley in Nepal. After the on-site survey, I stayed in Kathmandu for 2 months to summarize the data I had collected. It was here where I met Mr. Gyalrong Jambun from Chokche, Sichuan, a central town of Gyalrong area. He was a Tibetan refugee who happened to be in Darjeeling, India, on a business trip when the Tibetan uprising occurred in 1959. Unable to return home, he stayed in India with his wife, but he lost contact with his family after the uprising. Around 1979, the Chinese government changed its policy and allowed Tibetan refugees to return home, and the family was reunited in 1980 when his oldest son visited Kathmandu from Chokche to take his parents back home. I got acquainted with Mr. Gyalrong Jambun when he was waiting for issuance of a pass to be used in place of a passport to return home. With his assistance, I conducted an intensive survey centering on the morphosyntax of the verb system and accomplished the basis of my PhD dissertation. In January 1983, I returned to Berkeley to file the dissertation, which was accepted in late 1983. I retired from the National Museum of Ethnology in 2011. Looking back on the museum days, my functions and academic results may be summarized as follows. 1. Description of Gyalrong grammar as my personal pivot research. Comprehensive reference grammar of the language in English will appear next summer. 2. Teaching of Tibetan language as my pedagogical function. Actually, I taught modern and classical Tibetan at the Osaka University Foreign Studies for 19 years, thanks to the warm consideration by Professor Yabushiro, a Burmese specialist. 3. Description of material cultures of Tibet preserved in the National Museum of Ethnology. I engaged for the description of Aoki's collection and charms and amulets collection. I also contributed to the general display of China and South Asia sectors. 4. Carrying on the project concerning the linguistic substratum in Tibet under the perspective of Tibeto-Burman comparative linguistics. I organized the fieldwork project 7 times on Tibetan, Tibeto-Burman languages in general, and Shanshun with Ministry of Education grants for overseas research. 5. Carrying on the project concerning the religious substratum in Tibet, especially Bon. I organized the fieldwork project 4 times concerning Bon with Ministry of Education grants. The results appeared as 13 volumes of Bon studies from the National Museum of Ethnology, which can be downloaded free. I also convened an international gathering of Bon studies in 1999 and a special display of Bon culture in 2009. These attempts were always supported by Dr. Samten Karmay. Fortunately, I succeeded this year in obtaining a field survey grant, and I'm planning to observe the Kalon Sandu ritual somewhere if the COVID-19 problem is gone.
So can I ask you of the IATS conference?
Yes, I'm sorry to say that I have attended IATS meetings only twice. Professor Mimaki and Professor Takeuchi have been very positive to IATS since long, while I was not. This is probably because of another gathering exclusively specialized in Sino-Tibetan and Tibeto-Burman linguistics. It was organized in 1973 by Professor Matisoff and Dr. Paul Benedict, and it is held every year somewhere in the world, continuing until now. This conference is rather small-scaled, but the discussion is quite meaty. This Berkeley-Bonn meeting has been much more familiar to me and is enough for me.
Turning back to the Professor Hori's advice, who were the 2 or 3 bosses of you in your life?
Oh, bosses. Okay, first boss was Tokunaga in linguistics. Second was Hori in religious studies. Number 3 would be Kitamura in Tibetan linguistics. And then number 4 would be James Matisoff, UC Berkeley. So I got 4.
Yeah, 4 bosses and 3 are linguists.
Yes.
So if you have some impressions of the professor, for example, Matsuoff.
Matisoff. Well, he had been very famous since young. So I knew him by name for, probably Professor Nishi Yoshiro told me his Matisoff's name. So I thought he was a quite old man. But actually he is just 10 years senior to me. So he was very young. And well, he has a long experience of research as well as teaching. And maybe the most different thing within him from Japanese professors is that he is very good at praising students, not scolding. He never scolds. But he only praises. So suppose you have some arguments A and B, and if he agrees with A, he just praises A only. He never talks about B. That's why a student can understand he doesn't like B, or the student are wrong as far as the B is concerned. That's the way he is. So he grew so many students in UC Berkeley. So he was very good teacher as well as a researcher. So it is funny that once upon a time, I don't remember when it was, but the department chose him chairman. But the regents of the University of California refused it. He should teach and do research. Never let him touch administration. So that's his, it tells his characteristics very clearly.
Type of administrator.
Yeah, no.
So how about the Professor Yamaguchi? Probably he's not good at teaching.
No.
Does he praise?
No, never. He always criticized other persons. So the most famous and most severe discussion or attack is against Professor Ueyama Daishin. They disputed the Tunfan manuscript 116. Right? That's a famous story.
And also against Professor Gyalrong.
Yeah.
Disputes.
Yes. Yeah.
So you were one of the students of the Professor Yamaguchi.
Yes.
Yeah. So how was the atmosphere in the classroom when he taught you a Tibetan language? How about that?
Well, as far as grammar class is concerned, there was no discussion between students or the professors. But in the class of 5th Dalai Lama's Namtar class, we had Mr. Okimoto, Mr. Nishioka, Mr. Harada, and Mr. Hakamaya. Do you know? He's at Komazawa University now, and myself. So he had only 4 or 5 students. It was graduate. No, that's common. Graduate and faculty and common. So, but basically, only graduate students came.
So excluded.
Yeah, yeah.
How was the grammar class?
That
How was the grammar class?
Gram,
Yeah, as a linguist, how do you think?
as a linguist, I don't agree with his grammatical category, especially in around 2000, he published 2 or 3 grammar books. I think it is nonsense.
Okay.
I think the best thing he taught was the Tokyo University's textbook. Actually, yeah, as I said, it was based on Bunko's
Oh, yeah.
Index Morphologic. It was quite nice examples.
When you met Professor Samten Karmay youth days, when was the first?
First encounter was in 1974 or 5, maybe 4,
Oh, in Tōyō.
at the Tōyō Bunko. So at that time, he had already got the position at the CNRS in Paris. Yeah, but maybe Mr. Imaeda introduced him to Professor Kitamura, and Tōyō Bunko invited. And well, he was with his wife, I mean ex-wife, Heather, and we have Tōyō Bunko didn't have any dormitory, so Professor Kitamura and I looked for some appropriate apartment house in downtown Kamata.
Oh,
It is a kind of miserable place. And I and my wife lived together in the same apartment complex.
oh,
They lived upstairs and we were downstairs.
So you share the private life with her?
Yeah.
oh.
And in the first night, I learned that he is vegetarian. At that time, he didn't eat any fish. But later, he likes, I guess now he likes sushi. So, but at that time, he couldn't.
Yes, Japanese.
No, he doesn't like that. But he is a very regular man. So from Kamata to Tōyō Bunko, it takes about 50 minutes by train. He always departs around 8 o'clock and came back 6. That's it.
All day,
Every day.
on and off. So he enjoyed the Sunday.
No.
No.
On Sunday he was at home. Yes.
Okay.
How long did he stay in Kamata? 1 year?
The first time?
Yeah, first time.
First time they stayed for 6 months only.
6 months.
And then again Tōyō Bunko invited him for a year.
Okay.
And also you invited him in here in National Museum for his novels.
Yes, several times.
Several times.
Yes.
Very long ago.
Yeah. The last guest professorship was, when was that? 2003 or 4, when Mr. Tselintar submitted his dissertation here.
Oh, yeah, here.
Not here, but probably you know that we inter-university institutes established an independent university. It is called Sokendai. What is that? I don't. Graduate University for Advanced Studies. The headquarters is in Kanagawa Prefecture. So Selintar submitted his dissertation to that university, namely here. And at that time, Samten was here, and we carried out the final oral examination right here.
Oh, you too.
So you have many connections with other scholars in Tibetan studies all over the world, for example, Selintar, Matisoff, and Samten Karmay. And also, you are a president of Association of Tibetan Studies in Japan. So probably you know the history of the Association of Tibetan Studies in Japan. So when was first join of this association?
Association. It was 1972 or 3 when I came back from India. I submitted a paper on Muri language. That's the first time. But well, if I could say the general overview of Tibetan studies in Japan, maybe we have maybe the longest history in the world for Tibetan studies. So the first phase would be the beginning of the 20th century, or a little bit before the 20th century, but 3 monks entered Tibet to excavate the Buddhist texts, and they actually carried back them. Then some CIA-like persons went to Tibet. And the second phase would be Professor Gajin, Nagao Gajin, or Professor Sato Hisashi. They studied Tibetan things in Beijing instead of Tibet. So at that time, Tibet was still a mysterious land. And the third phase would be represented by Kitamura, Yamaguchi, or Nishida in linguistics, and myself. So it is kind so-called substitutional ethnography, because at that time we couldn't enter Tibet. But in place of that, we have got refugees in India or Nepal or anywhere in the world. That's the third phase. So maybe now, after 1985, Tibet was open to foreigners, and many young scholars can go to the field directly. So
you witnessed a change of the...
Yeah, it's a great change, yes. So maybe at first we had only Buddhist studies and philology, but now it's going to a combination of philology and fieldwork. It's a big change.
So probably the atmosphere of Association of Tibetan Studies, the annual meeting, was also changed.
Yeah, but I feel that it is getting too friendly to each other. There is no criticism at all. So it's a little bit dangerous.
Oh, yeah. You mean that we can't criticize each other.
No.
You know, that's the problem. Yes.
Yeah, that's because maybe a Tibetan studies, what the scholars engaged in Tibetan studies are a kind of minority. Yeah, that's the reason.
Yeah.
You mean the minority here in Japan?
Not only in Japan, but
in
also
Japan.
all worldwide.
I see. So how do you think about the situation of Tibetan studies in Japan? So is it quite dangerous, or things that we can manage continuing?
Well, yeah, it had been always dangerous.
Or the
Yeah, because in Japan, if Tibet were the independent country, the situation may be different. But especially in Ministry of Education's context, it is very difficult to establish the Department of Tibetan Studies. It is impossible.
especially for state-run university.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a basic basis of danger.
So we don't have any public official department for Tibetan studies in Japan.
No way.
But here, it was once. So
No, it is, well, this place is not particularly to Japan. So it's a kind of area studies.
Right.
So, for example, well, in UC Berkeley, for example, they have a very good system of joint program or joint program for doctorate degree. So some professors gather, then they can make a very specific department. For example, Tibetan Buddhism. But in Japan, it is impossible.
So the system is different.
Very different.
Were you the first teacher given lecture at the university, Osaka University? Osaka University?
Yes. Osaka University
Yeah, was it the
of,
first?
yes, I was the first. Yeah, because at that time, Professor Ono and Professor Yabu, both of whom are specialized in Burmese linguistics, they are quite eager to rename the department to Department of Burmese and Tibetan Studies. That's their desire. But it was rejected every year. So it is very difficult to establish Department of Tibetan Studies in national universities.
Because they have no country.
No.
So what do you think of the future of Tibetan studies in Japan? Because there are, for example, Tibetan studies in Europe, Tibetan studies in the United States, and also Tibetan studies in China mainland. So going to be bigger and bigger. So what is the status of Tibetan studies in Japan compared to other countries or Europe? What do you think?
Well, it is a general tendency worldwide that people's concern to Tibet is drastically decreasing. So maybe only China, it should be prosperous, but in Japan, in America, or in Europe, the Tibetan studies is gradually diminishing.